Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. So, I think, obviously today, we got some very exciting things happening, and tomorrow it's a very interesting week if you are at all interested in constitutional law and some of the arcana of how our system works. And today I'm going to go through some of the legal analysis that results, I think, from analyzing this particular claim by the president, which is the idea that the vice president has the power to fraudulently reject fraudulently chosen electors. So we're going to go through that and go through some of the legal analysis, some of the arguments that I've seen justifying this claim about what the 12th Amendment permits. But in addition, there are some housekeeping matters I want to deal with first. First and foremost, if you're in Georgia, go vote for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue today. You can stop watching this if you haven't done that and go get in line and do that. This is shockingly important to the conservative movement and to the Republican Party more generally. We need to win. If the consequences of unified Democrat government are something you don't want to see. And, it really is one of those sort of no-lose situations. Even the most aggressive arguments from people like Lin Wood would be immaterial at the moment. If, it's either on the one hand, everything is rigged against us and we're screwed no matter what. But on the other hand, assuming everything is not rigged against us, then we need to go vote and make sure our people win so we don't lose a majority in the Senate, which would allow for packing the court, adding new states, the unwinding of every good thing you've liked about what President Trump has done. It goes away. I think it's extraordinarily important. So people, if you are in Georgia, stop watching this and go vote for, go get in line and vote, please. Like, it's very important to the conservative movement. Generally, it's important, even if, it doesn't really matter what your set of beliefs are about the election. The cost-benefit ratio is in favor of voting. So go do it. Secondly, second housekeeping matter, if you're on Periscope shuts down in 3 months. It shuts down at the end of March. And I've been on Periscope for 3 years now, and I'm sad to see it go, but it means that we need to have, people move over and subscribe on another live streaming platform if we're going to have people, consistently getting notifications. So if you like the content that I've put out over the last 3 years, I would please request you to go ahead and go to youtube.com/human events and subscribe. We're going to, this is already currently live on YouTube. This is a way to get notifications of what I'm doing. And for all future live streams that I do that are in a formal setting, I'm certainly going to stream them to YouTube in addition to Periscope. So this is a way to ensure you won't miss anything and to make sure that we continue even after Periscope goes away. Okay. Housekeeping out of the way. Now let's start with, again, this tweet. So this tweet, it's pretty aggressive. It's a very aggressive legal claim. The idea that the vice president has the unilateral power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. And I've seen many people tweet this out, including, my friend Charlie Kirk and others, and pass it on. And I think it's worth analyzing. And before I get into it, I do want to make a quick appeal to say that there is an important dichotomy between descriptive arguments and normative arguments, right? And it's very important because people have often gotten very angry at me without distinguishing between those two things. A descriptive argument is one that is just a statement of how I think the law works, what I predict will happen. These are fact claims, either factual claims about the current world or claims about what will happen in the future. They're not normative. They're not what I want. They're prediction. They're forecasting. And that's a distinct from a normative claim. Normatively, I want the president to stay in power. And I'm not normatively sure if I really want the vice president to unilaterally assume power. I think it's fairly close. In general, I am very unsympathetic to arguments from precedent. Well, if we do this, we set a bad precedent. Democrats do unprecedented things all the time. But I'm not really going to focus heavily on the normative side of this question. I'm really going to try and focus on the legal argument. And so you guys see what's coming and aren't necessarily thrown for a loop. So the version of the legal argument that I've seen that is most assertive about this comes from the Substack article by Alexander Macris. Now, Macris, I think, previously worked for Milo Yiannopoulos, but he ran The Escapists, so some people have kind of tried to diminish him based on that. But Macris is a Harvard law grad, so he's not a trivial person. When he does legal analysis, it's not a joke. So, and I read through this article. I didn't think it was jokey. I thought he was trying to be pretty rigorous, although I think he slipped up at times. But I'm not I think it's non-trivial, and so I think it's worth analyzing. So, he says the key question is who counts the votes cast by the presidential electors. He rightly notes that the Constitution governs the election of the president, and the 12th Amendment says that the President of the United States shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. He basically, and here's where I think this is where Macro starts going on. He doesn't actually do linguistic analysis straight away. He just goes straight to a different law review article from somebody positing one particular interpretation that is possible, i.e., quote, going straight to this quote, the peculiar passive voice phrasing of this crucial sentence opens up the possibility of interpreting it to provide that the President of the Senate has the exclusive constitutional authority to determine which certificates to open and thus which electoral votes to be counted. I think he went a little fast here. I think he needed to sit and actually do some linguistic analysis. It said, let's just read this piece of text. The President of the United States shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The key thing to understand is this word shall. It's very important because it's mandatory language. In law, there's this appears throughout federal statutes, throughout case law. It's just all over the place. The distinguish between shall and may. Shall is mandatory language. When a law says shall, you don't have a choice. You have to do it. When a law says may, you have discretion. Seems pretty straightforward. So basically, I think the most natural reading that is obvious here is that the President of the Senate, this is effectively a ministerial provision. The President of the Senate doesn't have the meaningful discretion. He has to open all of the certificates, and the vote must be counted. There's a question about whether or not he has discretion in a certain case about which certificates could be counted, or like which certificate if there are competing certificates, but there's no actual norm or idea about who resolves that. But assuming there's only one certificate provided by a state that's legally certified, I think the correct answer about what this law means is that the president doesn't have the discretion. And that ultimately, I think as a legal matter, I think the president is wrong. Moreover, I think that's ultimately, this is my ultimate thesis. I think ultimately if the president went into court if the Vice President Pence tried to do this, he would be enjoined by courts almost immediately. I think there's an obvious person withstanding both Joe Biden and any of the Democrat electors whose votes were discounted by Vice President Pence using this mechanism. I think they would immediately be able to go into court and get an injunction. But let's talk about that's my position. Let's look at what is Macris using to sort of, to base this on. He's saying, quote, this interpretation, the one that says Vice President Pence can do this on his own, derives support from the observation that the President of the Senate is the only officer given an active role in the process of opening the certificates and counting the electoral votes from the states. The Senate and the House of Representatives on the CU have an observational role only. I think the problem with this is it still isn't an explicit grant of authority. That's the big issue here, is that when you everywhere else in like the Constitution, we see explicit grants of authority. So, for example, think about the pardon power for a second, right? The pardon power is like a plenary grant of authority to the president. It says the president has the power to pardon. It's at his discretion. So if courts try and intervene on that, they just can't. The courts have interpreted that phrase to say, look, the president has unilateral discretion. It's clear as day by the Constitution. That's not here, right? Nowhere in this provision of the Constitution is there a phrase that says the Vice President Pence has the authority to determine that a vote is fraudulent, that he has the discretion to refuse to count. In fact, it's the opposite of discretion. There's the mandatory shall language. It's just not there. And so it requires sort of like a little bit of hand waving to get to the idea that in addition to having this ministerial role of opening the certificates, he actually has the discretion to determine whether or not they're unilateral. And then I think another point that says this interpretation of the 12th Amendment is bolstered, moreover, by the further observation that the responsibility to definitively decide which electoral votes from each state are entitled to be counted must be lodged ultimately in some singular authority of the federal government. I actually don't necessarily think that that's true, right? I think that you could obviously see a situation where it was lodged in the states. And that's another kind of big lingering issue here, is that there's a big separation of powers concern, not necessarily between Congress and the presidency and whatever, but it's actually, this is a federalism concern, right? How much power does the federal government have vis-a-vis the states? And a big concern of since states are already given this discretion by the Constitution to run their own elections It actually seems like it would follow that state authorities have the ability to determine which electoral votes are right and which electoral votes are wrong. I think that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion. But moreover, like, I think one of the things that Macris does here, and I mean, he tries to disclaim it later, but I think a big problem is that Macris is basically putting forward these law professors as adhering to this point of view, and they don't really. Like, Foley wrote a lengthy article, and he's just basically talking about what could happen, arguments that could be made. It's not an aggressive point. And the person who really did this well, explained this well, was William Jacobson over at Legal Insurrection. He did a very good article entitled "No, Mike Pence Can't Just Reject Electoral Certifications." And he went through this Macris piece really well and explained that, Macris cited this Foley article and that it's not even Foley's opinion, that he's just presenting different viewpoints. And this is especially true, I think, and this is where I think Macris really does himself a disservice when he talks about the article from Mr. Harrison. So he starts here. He says, Foley is not alone in this analysis. Another prominent jurist, John Harrison, makes an even more forceful case. Harrison argues in Nobody for President that the most natural reading of the 12th Amendment grants the opening and counting power to of the President of the Senate. And he starts with the quotation, the 12th Amendment provides that in the presence of the two houses, the president shall open the certificates of the electors. Now, right off the bat, I have a real problem with what Macris did here because Macris did not cite this correctly. And in terms of like what the text says. So I actually have opened Harrison's article. And so the, like, where is this? Oh, sorry, that's not where he did that. He did. Sorry, I apologize. The big problem is this sort of like, I think it's here where he says a natural reading of the 12th Amendment thus indicates that in one especially important context, the dispute is to be resolved by a single individual. But that's omitting an important caveat, right? Here is where he says it. He says, quote, I'll zoom in so you can really see it. This is what Harrison says. If the 12th Amendment is assumed to be a dispute resolution mechanism, a natural reading would indicate these things. That's like an important caveat. Like, Harrison is not making the affirmative argument that the 12th Amendment says what Macris thinks it says. In fact, Harrison's ultimate conclusion is very different. Harrison says, as I view it, the Constitution doesn't grant any authority to the federal government at all to determine what certificates to open or to like throw out somebody's certificates as fraudulent. That's my best understanding of what Harrison has to say here. And I think that's probably the right answer because, I think here's an important caveat that this is something, and again, right after this quotation, Macris stops it and doesn't include this point. Quote, it would be hard to imagine that one person had been given this power even if we did not know that the president of the Senate would often be a candidate for the president of the United States. We know that well, as did the authors of the 12th Amendment. And that's exactly right. Because Jefferson, this is all about, because Jefferson pulled some shenanigans. So I think as a legal matter, so first off, Macris, I think he's giving short shrift to these authors who don't agree with his underlying claim. Like, they think it's a possible interpretation, maybe even a plausible interpretation, but neither of them agrees that it's the correct one. As a result, like, you actually have to think about what would happen in a court, or what's realistically going to happen here. And here's my forecast. Say in a world where Pence decided to unilaterally determine that certain states' electoral votes were wrong, that were fraudulent. What would happen? Well, it would just go straight to court and he would lose. This is not a circumstance where a court has no authority. The Constitution grants, the judicial power to federal courts who have the ability to say what the Constitution means. And without explicit language granting this discretion to the vice president, they're not going to say that a single person has the authority to overturn the results of an election. They're just not going to do that. And so Pence would be flying in the face of our federal courts, likely the Supreme Court, and he wouldn't do that. Moreover, I think Pence himself would be very reluctant to exercise this power. If this were true, then it also means that, any vice president who's running could foreseeably potentially make themselves president again. it really sort of ends our entire constitutional system, really, if this argument flies. Because, if you have the ability to unilaterally on your own say a state's electoral votes are fraudulent and not count them, then literally any vice president who's running will win, because they can just decide, they were fraudulent, without evidence, without any showing. I mean, that's probably, that given the way our Constitution creates all these checks and balances, that can't be the right answer. And that probably is not, and that's where I get to the normative problem. Like, I am probably not for Mike Pence unilaterally on his own deciding to overturn an election. I think that's probably a bad thing. I think that means the end of the republic. I am generally very unsympathetic to precedent arguments, but it seems just kind of obvious, like, that's the end, right? Like, we don't really have an electoral college system anymore. We don't have a democracy anymore. We literally have whoever is currently the sitting vice president gets to decide who the next president is system. And I don't think that's a good one. Because that's what effectively you're saying, right? If you're saying the vice president has the unilateral authority to determine what electoral votes are legitimate or not, whether to count them, and then then he determines who wins in every single election, right? So I think that's a problem. And somebody said something important, but he says, but the state sent two sets of electors. This is Brian Bortolotti. That's not quite right. The state's only certified one set of electors in this case, and there's the losing set of electors also voted together, but that doesn't mean that the state sent them. And so that's also, people are asking this question, what about a state who sent a competing slate of electors? That's an unanswered question, but that also, it's not germane, right? There is no state that's certified more than one slate in this election, even if there are competing the losing electors from the Republican side also voted for various reasons. So yeah, that's, and I agree with you, Brian. I understand that. Yeah, I took it for how you meant it, that you wanted my opinion on that. Here's another interesting thing that I've seen that I haven't seen many people talk about. So, as many of you have seen, Senator Hawley and others have moved to challenge the certification of electoral votes. You had Ted Cruz also saying the same thing. So where do they get the authority to do that? Well, that comes from, the Electoral Count Act of 1887, codified at 3 U.S.C. 15, counting electoral votes. Basically that the certificates of the electoral vote should be read. Upon such reading, the president of the Senate shall call for objections. Every objection shall be made in writing, and shall be signed by at least one senator and one member of the House. So basically all of this, all Hawley and Cruz, they're all invoking not the Constitution for their objections, but the act of Congress that gives Congress the authority to object or accept electoral votes. Here's the problem with that. From the perspective of the people who want to keep Trump in power, if indeed the Electoral Count Act is constitutional, then Vice President Pence has no authority to unilaterally reject these votes. That authority is in the hands of Congress. And you need a majority of both houses of Congress, which we don't have because the Democrats have the House majority. So really, the path that everyone is saying, well, everyone needs to fight back and object via Hawley and via Cruz's mechanism, et cetera, is already a path that will not lead to victory, because it's a path that assumes the constitutionality of 3 U.S.C. 15. All these arguments that are being made over here about Pence counting the votes, all these arguments, those are arguments that assume the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional because it arrogates the authority to determine which electoral votes are constitutional. So basically, the only real path to quote unquote victory here would be for Pence to push this theory that he unilaterally has the authority to reject electoral votes, and then for somehow to get vindicated. And I just don't think that's going to happen. So anyway, that's the kind of analysis here. The conclusion being, again, as a normative matter, I couldn't care less about pushing all these challenges. People, want to do it. I don't think the Democrats have a leg to stand on to complain. They spent 4 years trying to impeach the president over absolute nonsense. They did so on completely partisan lines, undermining you push for the 25th Amendment to be used. I have zero patience for arguments from Democrats of stamping their feet. That said, as a descriptive matter, I don't think the law gives the authority to Vice President Pence that President Trump thinks or anybody else thinks. As a lawyer, honestly interpreting these laws, I don't think that's right. And moreover, as a predictive matter, I don't believe that it would be successful if it were tried. I think that the courts have the authority to interpret the 12th Amendment, to interpret Vice President Pence's role, to say he has no discretion about whether or not to accept a state's certified votes. And so as a result, I don't think it would work. And because I don't think it would work, I think everybody needs to like temper their expectations. Moreover, I think a big part is that because everybody's focused their energy on the challenge to object by members of Congress, right? Like there's this huge debate. Would Josh Hawley object? Would all these people object? Because all the energy has been focused there, there really is no possibility of overturning the results of the election through that mechanism, because that requires adhering to the Electoral Count Act, which requires there to be a simple majority in both houses to sustain an objection to the electoral vote. There is no such majority. So, you know, that's kind of my prediction about what will happen. You know, and that this ultimately we're going to have President Biden. That's what I'm saying. So I'll try and answer some questions about this. Somebody says, Josh Line Photo says, what about post-election, say February, findings that would have changed the outcome? They could conceivably be the basis for impeachment, Josh. I don't know that they would be the basis for, you know, but that would not be the basis for like reinserting Trump as president, right? You could conceivably impeach the president, but they wouldn't be, you know, once the vote's certified and the guy's president, there's not a magic switch to reverse the results of an election. I want to just disagree with this. I think Trump being the last stand of the GOP, I think that's too black-pilled. You know, the president nearly won this election, and a lot of votes in places that we didn't think were turned, and we nearly won it despite there being a global pandemic. I think people need to like. It's not good that we lost the executive branch. It's very bad, but it's not the end of the world. And I think that's one of this sort of blackpilling is very distressing when it comes to trying to hold on to the Senate and not give unified government to the Democrats. Like, I think, you know, the Republican Party has done a good job in the last 4 years of reorienting its platform to be more in line with the people and the base. That's a good thing. We can build on that. You know, we shouldn't just throw up our hands and give up. I think that's really important, and I think people are being too black-pilled about it. So let's look. Yeah. Don't trust the Flan; it won't work. See, this is where I think you're wrong. Don says Pence will either do it or he won't. It's his call, and nobody could really stop him. I think that's wrong. I think that the Democratic lawyers are ready to go immediately to a court and get an injunction forcing Pence to open the certificates from the other states that he might disregard and count those votes. Because again, just to explain why, you know, it says it's the 12th Amendment. The president of the Senate shall open all their certificates and the votes shall then be counted. And as I described, that's mandatory language. It's not discretionary. So Pence has to do those things. So, and I'm not upset about Don. That's not like a personal attack. That was just, I wanted to correct that because I think it's important for the audience to understand something. Can Pence ask for assurance of legitimacy? I don't think he can really move I don't think he has any discretion. That's where I think all the people on our side are wrong. I see, you know, when the Constitution or our statutes grant discretion to a public officer, they say so explicitly. This is not that. Okay. One final one. Somebody, Secondhand Sampler says that the path to victory is a drawn-out vetting process to determine who is on which side of the fence. That doesn't really make much sense to me. I don't think that accurately captures what's going to happen here. It's really just determined by statutes and the Constitution. I think what you're going to see tomorrow is sadly a bit of a letdown. I think ultimately this is going to be an academic debate because I think Pence is going to open all the votes, and there's not a majority in both the House and Senate to object. So I think that'll be the end of that. Sadly. All right. So that's the end of that. Again, before you go, if you have not, important, you know, Periscope is shutting down soon. Please subscribe at youtube.com/human events. If you're closing it out, please make sure you go there and hit subscribe. It's very important because again, Periscope is gone. And if you are been a regular follower of my Periscopes for a long time, you're going to wake up on March 21st and suddenly not get them again. Maybe some of you think that's a blessing. I don't know, but I think most of, if you're watching this, I assume you like it. So please do that. And again, if you are in Georgia, please go vote for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. I think it's very important. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all your support. I appreciate you watching this. And I will talk to you tomorrow.